Have you ever wondered who issues a debit note and who receives the debit note? Have you ever wondered who issues a debit note and who issues a credit note? Many accounting students mix this up, especially in exams. Now, after watching this video, you won't ever again. A debit note is issued by a buyer to the seller, and it is a document that has a debit note number, a unique number. It has the date of the issue. It has particulars of the issuer and particulars of the sender. And it also has a description where you detail why the debit note is being sent. It is usually issued by the buyer to the seller to tell the seller that the buyer has debited his account with him. In other words, the buyer is saying, I have debited your account with me. Why does this happen? There are three reasons that I will call RDO. If you remember RDO, you won't forget it. The R is for returns. When goods are returned by the buyer to the seller due to one reason or the other, then a debit note will be issued. In other words, if originally the buyer bought goods worth 100 million and is returning some, let's say 20 million naira, it means the amount, the account of the seller with the buyer has been reduced by 20 million naira. So he has to issue a debit note to the seller to tell him that your account with me has been debited. It has been reduced by 20 million naira. That is the first reason. The first reason is returns. Goods have been returned to the seller by the buyer. The second reason is D. Now, when goods are damaged or defective, the buyer will also issue a debit note to the seller, telling him that the goods I bought for you, they were either damaged when your supplier supplied it, or maybe they are defective, either expired or they did not meet the specification. So defective goods, you won't pay for them. And also if they are damaged, of course, nobody wants to pay for them. So that will also reduce the amount that the buyer is supposed to pay to the seller. Now, the other one is overcharge. When the buyer discovers that he was overcharged, maybe because of mathematical calculation where you're supposed to add, you did a multiplication, or maybe the owner of the business was not around and they got a new manager who did not really know, still learning the ropes. And because of that, the manager overcharged either deliberately or inadvertently. Now, if that happened, there was an overcharge, the buyer will issue a debit note to the seller telling him that his account has to be debited, has to be reduced. So this is what a debit note is. It is issued by the buyer to the seller. Now, let's go to credit note. A credit note is also issued by the seller to the buyer. And it is also a document that has similar features like what I explained about the debit note. Also, the three reasons I want to give you why a seller will issue a credit note to the buyer, I will also call it RDO. If you remember RDO, you won't forget. The first one is returns. When the buyer returns goods to the seller will make some adjustments. The seller will say, okay, I have seen your debit note and I've agreed that really some goods were returned to me. So I am issuing you a credit note, okay, to reduce what you are supposed to pay me. That is the R. The next one is D. The seller issues a credit note to the buyer if he has granted the buyer a discount. Perhaps the discount was not factored in at the earlier stage. So if a discount is agreed upon or the seller decides to give a discount, then what the buyer is supposed to pay to the seller has to be reduced. So the seller will issue a credit note to the buyer, intimating him that he is to pay less because his account has been reduced. And lastly, if we have an overcharge, if the seller agrees that there was an overcharge, that the buyer was initially overcharged, then the necessary adjustments have to be done. So the credit note issued by the seller is to the buyer to intimate him that he was overcharged and because of that he will pay less. So if you enjoy these tips, I want you to like, I want you to share, I want you to subscribe to the Accounting and Finance Coach for daily tips on financial literacy. And also don't forget to enjoy our deep dives into the International Financial Reporting Standards. We demystify all the difficult topics in accounting and finance. My name is Echala Okori, your Accounting and Finance Coach.